welcome to this week's episode of This Gingerbird Goes Charity Shopping. So this week we're going to focus on all things vintage and shopping vintage. So vintage is defined as something that originated from a previous era. This can stem across clothes, homewares, accessories, basically everything. So vintage clothing always used to sell at much cheaper prices because of their perceived age. However, with vintage now becoming more desirable and with trends ever more evolving to include vintage looking items, they are becoming much more sought after and commanding much higher price points. Now, I don't know about you, but I always assumed that vintage were things that were like from the 70s or earlier. However, vintage is anything that is between 20 and 100 years old. So if I think back to when I was wearing those horribly fluorescent boob tubes, the butterfly clips, big fluffy earrings in the year 2000, those things are now classed as vintage. I know. Anything previous to that, so anything 100 years old or more, is defined as an antique. So there are many places to get your hands on vintage second-hand items. So this includes specialist vintage stores, markets and websites. These places are usually the easiest to find vintage because they have specially curated ranges, they are sought after and sourced by other people, and usually they focus on the trend of the time as well. So if, for instance, oversized men's shirts from the 70s are in, they'll have a big selection of those things. So it's definitely easier in specialist vintage retailers to find specific items. So charity shops also sell vintage items, but usually this is just potluck. There are only a few charity shops that specifically focus on vintage styles. Most of the time it's based on whether you're the right place at the right time. However, if you are lucky enough to find what you're looking for in a charity shop, usually it'd be much cheaper than vintage retailers. This is because charity shops are out to make money for the charity, whereas the vintage retailers will hike the price up because they know when things are desirable, and ultimately they're a business trying to make money for a corporation. So other places you can find vintage retail are things like Etsy, Depop for specific things, and eBay. However, these marketplaces generally are quite crowded, there's quite a lot in there, and usually you have to scroll through quite a lot of rubbish to get to what you're after, and sometimes it can take time. However, once again, if you've got that time and you're willing to dedicate to it, then you can find what you're looking for, once again, usually sometimes even cheaper than charity shops, with certain auctions on eBay, for example, starting at 99p. Things like Depop, it's not an auction, but you have to message the seller. Sometimes you can negotiate their selling price as well. So on that, there are also high street retailers, because upcycling, reimagining things, reusing, recycling things is becoming ever more prevalent, and us as a consumer are becoming much more aware of this. There are high street retailers that have their own ranges of recycled and upcycled clothes. So ones that spring to mind are things like Urban Outfitters and Topshop, where they have their ranges of reimagined vintage items. In my next episode, I'm going to be focusing on sizing. However, I just wanted to note that vintage sizing is very different from modern day sizing. If you watch episode 3 that I will be releasing next, I will go through what that means and what each sizing from each era means compared to today's high street sizes. But just be aware that what's on the label is not what it is today. So always try things on. Obviously at the moment we can't try things on, so take it home, try it on, or measure it with a measuring tape if you're not sure. And finally, if you can sew, or you have lots of fabric, or you want to give it a go, you can get vintage patterns in charity shops. They're pretty much always vintage, and they're usually super cheap. Most of mine I've picked up for anywhere between 50p and £1. So that is a great place if you're a dab hand with a sewing needle or a machine. Obviously, with vintage and retro styles forever coming in and out of fashion, there are always new products on the high street to buy. However, just think about it. If there's something that you really like that you know has been lifted from the 70s or the 60s or even the 80s, just think again and see if maybe you can get an original first from either a vintage shop or from a charity shop. I found this lovely 1980s dress. This cost me £2 from a charity shop. It's in beautiful condition. So there you go, you can find anything vintage that you're looking for secondhand somewhere. You just have to look. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode of This Ginger Bird Goes Charity Shopping. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and check out all of my other videos. You can also follow me on Instagram at This Ginger Bird. Thanks again for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.